Great. Does sludge slow the sustainability transition? That's the question that I'm trying to pose. And I think, first of all, what is Sludge? Well, I just had to add having to re-enter registration info to join Zoom meetings, I think is Sludge. Many other things are Sludge as well. Unfriendly service stuff. You can read all of these things. That's all Sludge. Last time you were annoyed by something, it might have been Sludge. Chances are good that it was Sludge. When Kasansin talks about it, Stuart and I were recently in a room with him, and there he says that he stopped mentioning excessive or unnecessary. So he now starts talking about frictions that make it harder to do what we want in order to avoid the conversation that you have about whether specific paperwork, whether that is excessive or unnecessary. For a sludge audit, you don't need to identify whether it's excessive or unnecessary. But it's a really interesting discussion of whether these things are needed or whether they are not needed. But maybe it's not the discussion for sludge. So it's a really interesting thought. But he focuses on frictions that make it harder to do what we want. Just wanted to mention really that it is really exploding, the research on this. On the left, you see that the UN Innovation Network, they focus on sludge reduction. In the middle, you see a OECD report that they brought out, I think in August, just recently, on fixing frictions, sludge audits around the world. And you can also see that co-authors were the New South Wales Government Behavioral Insights Unit, and I will mention them again because they are absolute world leaders on sludge. I also wanted to highlight that if you're interested in what's happening in the US, the Biden-Harris administration really pushes a fight against sludge, in this case from the private sector. So that's really something that's interesting to read if you're interested in this. And just as 3 examples of how this area is exploding a lot. Now, let's apply this to the sustainability transition. Does sludge slow this transition? Anecdotal evidence, as proven by Liz earlier on, is definitely yes. And that is more or less also why I got interested in this topic. I was interested in sludge, and I talked to my colleagues in Dublin in environmental policy and friends, and everybody has a story about how annoying it is to apply for a grant to make something environmentally friendly or to do other things. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting that sludge is a problem here. And when we looked into the literature, and we summarized this on the website climateadminburden.ie, an Irish website, in a living literature review, when we looked into the literature, we found, yes, indeed, in many studies that try to identify barriers to sustainable action, many of these studies identify that administrative burden or sludge are indeed is indeed a barrier to sustainable action. But most of these papers indeed find that admin burden is a problem, and they indicate this in the results section. And there are very few papers that really take the sludge perspective or the administrative burden perspective. So that's what we are trying to do. And in order to do this, maybe more systematically, I think the right approach is to look at case studies to identify whether sludge is a problem. And then is the big question, how do we organize these case studies? How do we communicate information about sludge? And the idea that Cass Sunstein there suggested is that we run sludge audits. So that's one of the earliest papers, and I think a really good paper, and this paper kicked off a lot of thought. In particular, thought by the New South Wales Government Behavioral Insights team, who really took this idea of sludge audits and developed a whole program around it. And this is really fantastic. The sludge audit method that they produced is great. And they also introduced a tool where you can log in online, and they will give you the access if you ask them nicely. And then you can run sludge audits on their website. And we used this tool for the case studies, and I give you a few insights of what you can do. So it's really fantastic work that they're doing. They have a whole sludge toolkit. So I just advertise their work a little bit because they make everything freely available, and it's really great. If you're interested in sludge, that's the place to go to. Okay, so what we do is we use a slightly different definition of what sludge is, and that's the definition from the paper that Stuart, thanks a lot for the nice words about that paper. in that paper, we define sludge as aspects of the choice architecture that lead to the experience of costs. So the choice architecture links it to the nudge literature, to behavioral science, and so on. And it's not about capacity, not about taxes or finances and so on. It's about choice architecture. And the nice thing of linking this definition to costs is that we can look at other literatures, for example, the literature on transaction costs or administrative burden, because these literatures have typologies of costs. And for example, we took some typologies and they suggest that search costs are a problem, and Stuart talked about them, but also evaluation costs. So when you have to make an environmental decision, there are pros and cons, and sometimes it's really difficult to evaluate these pros and cons of that decision. So these would be evaluation costs. Then there are implementation costs. Once you have decided that you say want to cancel an Amazon Prime membership or whatever, you have to implement that decision. So implementation costs are problematic. Psychological costs, when you feel ashamed or you feel uncomfortable going through or talking to somebody, these are psychological costs. And time costs, things cost time, and that is annoying. Now, why did we make this change? Because now actually, this quite beautiful question, does sludge slow the sustainability transition, becomes, well, a bit of an ugly question, but a helpful ugly question. Does the choice architecture lead to search costs, evaluation costs, implementation costs, psychological costs, and time costs that slow down the sustainability transition? Now, this is not a question that is as nice as the earlier question, so it shouldn't be the title of a talk, but it is a question that makes it much easier to run a sludge audit, because it's much easier to identify, there is a process that makes it harder for people to find something, that is search costs. That's much easier to identify than to just think about sludge where you don't really know what it is. So these typologies are really helpful to organize our thinking. Now, what's also really important is then to know what the sustainability transition is. And in order to look into that, we looked into the Irish Climate Action Plan. So because this is the work that I'm now presenting is from a funded project from the Environmental Protection Agency in Ireland, and it's called the ABICAP project. ABICAP stands for Assessing Administrative Burdens, or Sludge, as Barriers to Implementation of Ireland's Climate Action Plan. So the sustainability transition in this case were multiple hundred specific actions that the Irish government had identified that they want to achieve. And we now looked into a few of these actions to see whether administrative burden are problematic there. Maybe it's the first project that investigates environmental policy making from a sludge perspective. And since I left Ireland and came back to Scotland, Cara Augustenberg took over the leadership, and also members of the group of the ABICAP project are Margaret Samahita, Lucy Martin, and Patty Lenz. And we're working on this together, and it's a great fun to work on this, and I think really important as well. Now, how to run sludge audits is the first question that I think is interesting for everybody to look at when you're getting into that. So I think the main information source should be semi-structured interviews. But how do you run these interviews? You don't really know how to. So we wrote a guide on how to run semi-structured interviews with Lucy Martin, and that is available on that link over there. Then we have 3 steps in each sludge audit. And the first step is a journey map, and the second step is a step-by-step sludge audit. And this is where we really rely on the New South Wales Government Insights team and how they run the sludge audits. And I'll show you some examples later on. And then the third step is a qualitative assessment. And I also show you some examples of why I think it's really interesting to engage in this qualitative assessment. Now, what I'm going to present you is 2 case studies that take this approach. And I think it's really important to take this nitty-gritty, very specific case study approach, because sludge is a very nitty-gritty thing. Sludge in one specific area can be very different to sludge in another area. So I present you 2 case studies, the first one on solar schools and the other one on afforestation. And the sludge in both areas is very different. Now, the solar school scheme, our working title for the paper is Sludge Slows Solar School Scheme. I don't know if we stick with that, but this basically in Ireland, the Irish government decided that they want to put solar panels on every school in the country. That is good for the environment, but it's also a good symbol for students to learn about that. So, and in the first attempt that they made, they were very much surprised that they gave money to the schools and nobody was interested in that. It was just too burdensome, too sludgy. So they totally changed the system, what the school principals mainly have to do in order to get a solar PV panel, solar PV panel on their roof. And here's the journey map of this. I will not go into detail of what exactly the journey map is, but this is the type of journey map that you need to do in order to do a sludge audit, because you go into quite detailed steps. You have general stages and then detailed steps. And sludge happens at these very detailed steps. So you need to identify these detailed steps. You need to be uncomfortably precise. Now, in the interviews, we show earlier versions of this journey map to the interview participants, and they look at this and they say, oh, that's actually really interesting. I now suddenly know what I should have known before. So that is really helpful for people in the interviews. Now, once we then have identified the first step and then improved the journey map in the interviews, we go step by step. And for each step, we identify how sludgy each step is. And then we use the New South Wales Government Behavior Insights Team Sludge toolkit for that. And for that, we will identify, for example, here's a step with a text message, which can be very sludgy. The red one would get a number 5, or not that sludgy. The green one would get a number 1. And there are about 100 pages of these sludge scales that the NSW team suggests. And that gives us a little bit of a more objective evaluation of whether a specific step should be a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5. Now we take the same journey map that we had before and take all of these steps and then use these sludge scales in order to give a specific sludge rating for each of these steps. And then we also use the interviews in order to identify whether there might be search costs, psychological costs, or other types of costs. So we have also a more qualitative assessment of what these costs are. And that gives us a more holistic picture. So that's the second step. And then we can come up with something like this. And here you see quite a lot of green and a bit of yellow. This is a process that is quite fine. It's not too much of a problem here. The sludge is not crazy in this process. Will be different in the next one. But here's the third step, and that is kind of interesting. When we have these interviews, we can also analyze them using thematic analysis. And we find quite interesting things here. One of the interesting things linked to evaluation costs, that these are school principals. These are people who run schools. They are not experts on putting solar PVs on your roof. So for something that might be simple for some people is really difficult for them. So these are I don't have expertise in this area, one school principal said. And then another thing that is interesting in the context of Stuart's presentation is that it was hard to find contractors for some people. And that is problems of infrastructure, not problems of sludge. So at one stage, we get into brown infrastructure. Now, let me talk about the second case study, that's afforestation. So Ireland used to have 80% of its ground was forest, then it went down to almost 0. Now it's 18%, I believe. So, and in order to achieve climate action targets, Ireland needs to build many, many more trees. And there's money available for these trees and an afforestation scheme, but it's very difficult for farmers or landowners to get these trees. Now, again, this is a journey map, and I won't go into detail here, but it is very complicated for landowners to get these trees on the ground. And when we do the same step-by-step sludge audit again, there is some red and some less red. And the biggest problem happens if a letter comes in the post, and that is the letter that's called the further information required letter. And that letter wants you to do many more checks of whether, for example, certain birds are harmed when you build new trees, or whether there are environmental problems and so on. So this is becomes very sludgy there. You can see that here the ecological surveys and the further information required letter are really the problems when you run this. And this is the area where we could do different, we could improve the system. Now, if we again look in the qualitative elements, for example, evaluation costs are really high. In all the interviews, the farmers and the landowners talk about the uncertainty. They have no idea how good or bad stopping being a farmer for this particular land and building trees there is, what the costs or benefits there are. Is really, really high evaluation costs. And maybe the biggest problem was the time cost, the absence of timelines. So the landowners just have no idea how long it will take until they are allowed to build the trees and when they get the money. It's just horrible to get the license, that there's so much uncertainty in terms of the timeline. And there's much more, and then I won't go into detail now, but I think really interesting to take this more detailed perspective. Our last slide, the future work. I think we want to do more sludge audits, for example, sludge audits on retrofitting and heat pumps. It's something that always comes up. We also want to improve the design of these sludge audits to make them even more straightforward. We have great tools for this, but we can maybe improve them still. It's early days. We want to find ways to effectively communicate insights from work on sludge. So one reason why nudging was so successful is that you could present these very simple bar graphs and say, look, here's a control group, here are treatment groups, and here's an effect. Can we find better ways to communicate sludge work as well, sludge identification and sludge reduction work? So I think that is really important for the success of this area. We want to build more material for further sludge identification and reduction work so that other people can do that as well. And then we do something very different. We run survey studies and we go into the field very soon to identify, for example, who suffers most from sludge. Maybe you are somebody who doesn't have a problem with paperwork, and I have big problems with paperwork. And that is, I think, really interesting to identify what predicts these differences in us. And we'll also run experiments both in the lab and in the field on sludge reduction. And if anybody is interested in sludge reduction, mainly in the environmental area, really get in touch. I'm really happy to chat about this. So does sludge slow the sustainability transition? I think yes, one friction at a time, but it is a friction, it is one little thing at a time, and we need to go to that level of detail in order to identify sludge there. But I think it's really needed. And whenever I talk with policymakers about this, they love that stuff because they really feel that this is an area where we need to do things. So, and I hope that you will also see that there is a lot that needs to be done. And I hopefully maybe some of you will join us and we try to identify and reduce sludge in order to achieve the sustainability transition.